Good afternoon. Welcome to this week's talk in the Behavior, Evolution, Culture Speaker Series. First, a housekeeping announcement. Someone left some keys at the head of the buffet line. These belong to anyone? We meet every Monday of the academic year, every Monday with class sermon session at this time in this room, and sometimes there are talks on other days as well. To find a list of talks, you just Google UCLA BEC. Our website will be at the top of the list, and from there you can navigate to the page that lists upcoming talks. At every talk we circulate a sign-in sheet, which we ask you to sign so we can demonstrate to decision makers that there's a substantial constituency for these talks. In recent meetings, the sheet has ended up not being signed by a large fraction of the people in the room, and so I want to sort of specify the protocol here. It's right there right now. It's going to go around the outer ring of people and then around the inner ring of people. Okay. Before introducing today's speaker, I want to remind you that next Monday, the last Beck talk of the quarter, our speaker will be Jay Belsky of UC Davis, and the title of this talk is Childhood Experience and the Development of Reproductive Strategies, an Evolutionary Theory of Socialization Revisited. And then after the holidays, we'll meet again on January the 6th, when we'll hear from Pamela Smith at UCSD. She'll be speaking on the social distance theory of power. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Andrew C. of UC Davis, and he'll be talking about three frontiers in the study of behavioral syndromes, aka animal personalities.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you very much. And so this thing is on, and you can tell it's all going? Okay. All right, so yeah, thanks very much for inviting me down here, and I'm enjoying my visit so far. So here's what I'm going to talk about, which is, I think of as sort of an update on some of the ongoing research in my lab in this general field of behavioral syndromes and animal personalities. And before I go further, I do want to note this coming attraction, which is a talk I'm giving tomorrow at noon in this room here, which is on this other topic that overlaps a little bit with the behavioral syndrome stuff, but is one of my sort of newer conceptual obsessions, I guess, is theory to try to explain variation in how well different individuals or species are responding behaviorally to human-induced rapid environmental change. And so this could include humans, but it's sort of like everything has been thrown in with novel, strange circumstances, often by things that we're doing. And some animals kind of get it and others don't. And what theory can we develop to better explain that variation? So just wanted to advertise this talk I'm giving tomorrow. Okay, so into the animal personality stuff. This is the slide I've decided to start with. And incidentally, this is a new talk where I have added new stuff, taken out some stuff, in my mind imagining that I've taken out as much as I added in, but probably not. So it's probably too long relative to the sort of 45, 50-minute notion. But nonetheless, there are 3 chapters to it, so there'll be 3 obvious stopping points where we could talk about, questions on that point. But in that case, who knows how long this will go, but let's I guess, see how it unfolds. Okay, so here's this picture of members of my lab group, and we're actually at our sort of a retreat in Mendocino. And the main point of this slide is going to be that these people have different personalities. So we have Sean back here, who is doing a Sean-like thing. He's doing something silly and energetic. He's an outgoing guy. And this was not a surprise. Sean might do something like this. We also have Tina, who was a grad student here, but now postdocing in my lab. But we also have Anna, who is a much more quiet, reserved, relative to Sean, relatively serious person, and here even serious and quiet and reserved, even in the face of the fact that her boyfriend, Dave, we may have noticed, is buried right up to his shoulders there, and yet Anna's pretty calm about that. And this is the way they are. They have these different personalities, and we're pretty used to that about humans that we know. They have sort of a certain way that they do things. They're kind of have a consistency, a predictability about how different people do things. And we're also, I think, comfortable with that for, say, dogs and cats, that dogs have a different type of personality than cats on average, and that each individual dog has a personality, a consistent way of being. But in the last decade or so, you may know that there's a growing recognition that lots of species have something you could call a personality. And in fact, all of these species have gotten quite a lot of study on their personality. And at this point, what I'll do is sort of show you the outline of the talk, where I will say a little bit more, if you're not familiar with this literature, on what is a personality or behavioral syndrome, where is the field now, and then go into these three, what I'm calling emerging areas or frontiers, which is just my fancy way of saying these are three areas that we're studying in my lab. So, what is a behavioral syndrome or a personality? And actually, is it too bright in here? Should we turn off part of the lights? Any opinions on that? Should I go? Yeah. Let's see. What happens if I do this one? Is that better? Okay, yeah, let's go with that. So the general idea of a personality is that although individuals in many species, most I think that have ever been looked at, exhibit behavioral plasticity, how bold or aggressive they are depends on the circumstance they're in, that even in the face of behavioral plasticity, individuals often show a consistent behavioral types. For example, some are on the more bold side, others are on the more shy or cautious side, others are somewhere in between. So there's usually a sort of a continuous range. But individuals have a bold to cautious type, somewhere in that range, and that there's variation in individual aggressiveness, some more aggressive, unaggressive, some more exploratory, less exploratory, proactive, reactive, more social, more asocial, and so on. And that statistically, what we mean is that there is a statistically, analyzable signal that within individuals, they show some behavioral consistency, some predictability for that individual, and consistent differences between individuals. And this statistical concept is basically drawn from human personality studies, but now applied to other animals, and that we see this in many animals. For behavioral syndromes, the additional idea has been the emphasis on suites of correlated behaviors that go across different ecological or social contexts, like we might quantify variation in aggressiveness of, let's say, males in contests, and that the more aggressive males perhaps beat up other males and get a good territory, but that growing data evidence that aggressiveness in contests might also be correlated to sort of aggressiveness in a feeding context, even with no competitors around, just in the sense that more aggressive individuals then are just more aggressive about jumping out there and fearlessly attacking stuff and killing it, and perhaps having a higher feeding rate. And also evidence that general aggressiveness also comes out in a mating context, where males that are aggressive in how they go about mating might actually engage in more sexual coercion than other males. And furthermore, some evidence that it spills over to be related to their style of parental care, that very aggressive males tend to just not be able to settle down as well and be a good parent. And in fact, lots of evidence that general aggressiveness seems to be correlated to boldness with predators present, so that the same males that are aggressive here, get good territories, win, have high feeding rates, might actually take more risks than they ought to. And not to say they will be killed, but they have a higher risk, higher rate of possibly ending up being killed. And so I do mean to note that a general personality, a behavioral syndrome that carries over across all of this often has good things about it, being the aggressive, bold type, but often having a personality is associated with less than optimal behavior in some contexts. So in humans, the bold person, that's a good thing in some contexts, but actually seems to be associated with crazily silly behavior on the ski slopes or whatever that could get you hurt. And the shy, cautious person, in fact, doing some suboptimal behavior in being too shy and not taking advantage of opportunities they could have because of basically their personality. Okay, and that this general sort of notion also true for other animals. And so over the last decade, there's been a lot of work on this. And a lot of it, I'm going to say, is in some sense descriptive work, in that it's really just going out there and also quantifying, is there a personality signal statistically in my system? And in fact, yes, often we find animals do exhibit personalities, individual consistency, individual differences. and that there's quite a bit of work on proximate mechanisms, that these behavioral types, that I'll abbreviate as a BT for behavioral type, they do have neuroendocrine correlates with sort of hormone levels. They do have genetic basis, heritable connection to candidate genes. Your behavioral type affects your fitness in ways that depend on the environment, where if you're in an environment that is not well matched to your personality, individuals do often exhibit suboptimal behavior. Populations of species do differ in their behavioral type and also differ in their behavioral correlations. So there are studies showing that sometimes within one species, say bold and aggressive, are positively correlated, but in other populations or situations in the same species, they're not correlated. Okay, so we see variation in that correlation structure. And then as far as sort of stability over time or effects over time, there are studies showing strong effects of early experiences, but other studies showing surprisingly little effect of early experience on later personality. And another way of thinking of it over a longer scale is sometimes personality is stable over a fairly long time period, but other times it's not, in which case you might even say this population or these individuals are not even showing a clear personality. Okay, so there's a lot of variation in the phenomenon. And what I'm going to do is build on that basic introduction to address these emerging issues, and rather than repeat these, I'll just launch into it. So the first chapter is going to be attempts to have a general theory to explain the variation we see in the personality phenomenon. So questions you might ask, at one level people often might ask, why is Sean so energetic, outgoing, and silly, while Anna is more reserved and serious? Why do the individuals differ in their personality? But at a deeper level, you might ask, why do individuals even have a personality at all? Because there's no sort of law of physics or something that would say you need to be consistent as opposed to infinitely plastic. That in all circumstances, you could have the best behavior, in which case one could say you're so plastic you don't have a signal of personality. But rather than have individuals that are totally plastic, what we tend to see is some individuals do this. Say they're more bold, others do this, they're more cautious. They're all being plastic, but with different ranges. Why do they do that as opposed to exhibit the full range when in fact sometimes they're showing suboptimal behavior? So why should we even have a personality type at all? Okay? And then there's variation in the phenomenon. In fact, some individuals are more plastic than others. What might explain that? How stable are behavioral types over a lifetime? How strong are these early experience effects? What is the pattern of behavioral correlations, and why should we sometimes see bold and aggressive correlated, other times not? We've now been in this field of animal personalities long enough that we know there's a lot of variation in what we see. And so what my contention basically is here is that we're still, as a field, in the stage of collecting case studies and describing the fact that there is, in fact, quite a lot of variation, and we're only just getting going on theory that explains the overall pattern and even predicts how it should work, so that when you do your next study, you're not just quantifying, in my system, I found this. You're actually testing predictions that came out of a theory that you would then say, oh yes, that fits theory, or it didn't, and that leads us to readjust what is our theory doing, which is how we think of science in general, I think, is that we have theories and we're testing theories, but largely in this field right now, it's still lots of case studies, not actually testing some general theory. So what I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes or so is basically summarize things that my lab and associated or collaborative labs are doing on the general theory of behavioral syndromes, which even starts with what's the framework one would use to try to predict these things. Okay, and so here's the general framework that several labs have converged on. And it starts with the notion that behavior, at least in principle, could be completely plastic. Again, no laws of physics that say you couldn't go from totally bold to totally cautious from moment to moment. But in fact, if your best behavior is anchored to, connected to some slower changing state variable, that would tend to anchor you to a slower changing behavioral repertoire. Okay, and the state variables one might think of, one could even define as just things about the organism that are relatively stable. They change over time, perhaps, but they change relatively slowly. That what your state was a moment ago does have quite a lot to do with your state is the next moment. And these are things just like your overall physiology, your neuroendocrine state, your morphology that could change, but can't change instantly to, you know, anywhere it goes. I mean, it tends to change slowly, but it could be your energy reserves, your condition, your vigor, just even how big you are, your reproductive value, and for that matter, your information or skill set. And the idea is often these might actually help to explain, you know, what your behavioral type is right now and help to anchor it. But beyond that, there's a convergence on the notion that a key is feedbacks between behavior and state. So it's not just that your state determines your behavior, there's a feedback that your behavior then affects your future state, and they loop back on each other in this feedback loop. And so that even, recognizing that even influences what we call the notion of a proximate mechanism. Because many of the state variables that I listed are classically called proximate mechanisms that underlie behavior, as if that tells you the behavior. But once you get the feedback, then it's not that this proximate mechanism determines the behavior, it's actually the nature of the ongoing feedback loop. Okay, and if there are positive versus negative feedbacks, you get different outcomes in the same way that you would get that in any sort of system dynamics. And that positive feedback loops tend to drive divergence, where even small differences early on can diverge out or will diverge out into very different states and behavioral types and explain persistent long-term differences in behavioral type. And you know, one example of a positive feedback loop is the so-called winner-loser effect, where simply by winning, you increase the chance that you'll win more, and by losing, you increase the chance that you lose more. These are positive feedback loops that would tend to result in winners and losers. And I'll talk about other positive feedback loops in a second. But in contrast, there are negative feedback systems, you know, all over in biology of homeostasis, density dependence, or even just, you know, how your thermostat works, that tend to drive systems into a convergence to a sort of a middle point. And a classic negative feedback loop in behavioral evolutionary ecology is what's called asset protection, where the idea is if you have high assets, which could be energy reserves or reproductive value or something like that, then you should be cautious because you've got a lot you could lose and you just don't want to take a chance with all the stuff you've got. Okay? But in fact, if you're cautious, you're not out there getting more assets, and over time, your assets won't go up, and they probably will even start to erode. Whereas in contrast, if you have low assets, this mechanism says you've got nothing to lose, and in fact, you better go out there and get more, because you can't just sit there with low assets. You should be bold, perhaps aggressive, take chances. You might get killed, but if you do live, the whole idea is you're trying to increase your assets. So this sort of negative feedback says different assets result in different behaviors, but in fact, over time, this would generally result in convergence in the assets, in which case, if it was the assets that drove the difference in behavior, you get convergence in behavior, and you wouldn't have long-term stable differences in behavioral type. Does that all sound fine? Okay. So next, I'll just note that other positive feedback loops that seem plausibly common include things like learning and a skill set or associated information states, where the simple idea is if you are, say, the bold type, you do bold things, you get skill at how to be bold and how to do it successfully, which would dispose you to continue to be bold, which would give you even more practice and skill at being bold. Same thing for being shy, and both of those positive feedback loops taking you further and further away from even knowing how to do the other lifestyle, the other behavioral types successfully. Positive feedback loop. Another one that goes through state that is kind of like the asset idea, but it predicts the opposite, is this feedback loop through state-dependent safety or foraging success. So here, your condition or your vigor, if you're in great shape, very vigorous, you can literally be safer while you're being bold because you can outrun predators or maybe just beat them up or whatever. And since you can do that, it allows you to be bold, which allows you to go out and get the energy to continue to be in high, great condition. even more obviously perhaps is if you're in great condition, very vigorous and strong, you can outcompete others in fights or maybe even just in collecting food quickly. And this is what even game theory predicts. If you've got high RHP in game theory, you would have high chance of winning, so you should be aggressive, and that would keep you bringing in lots of energy. And I'm not saying the world has to be that way, but that's a known sort of line of logic. And conversely, in fact, if you're in poor condition, it would be disastrous to go out and try to be bold and take your chances with the predators. You're too weak to do that well, and you're certainly not going to be aggressive in fight because you're going to get beat up. So you're not going to be bold or aggressive, but then if you're hiding, you're not going to get much energy. You're going to stay in poor condition. So these would be conceivable positive feedback loops through this. And other positive feedback loops that I just didn't want to take more and more slides on, but actually might even be pretty obvious, is your social rank or role could dispose you to exhibit certain behaviors that would tend to keep you in that rank or role, that would keep you doing those behaviors that keeps you in that rank or role as a positive feedback loop. Okay, or it might even just be habitat choice. You prefer habitats where favors doing a certain behavior that in fact keeps you in that habitat and so on. Or not, so that's the key. It may or may not, but the nature of that feedback loop is crucial. Going to go off to the side and just note that some of the recent work in my lab has actually emphasized parasites as a part of the loop. And this is this cool thing where there's a feedback between personality and parasites. And this is work involving behavioral manipulation of hosts by the parasite. Kind of fascinating, cool thing that might in fact apply to humans, like you personally. But here it's applying to these fish. These are killifish, and they're actually only about this big. They're small fish. They get a trematode fairly commonly. In fact, in many of the coastal marshes in California, almost all the killifish have this trematode at some level. The trematode goes to their brain. Picture their brain where they insist. And this is work done by actually quite a few people, mostly at UCSB and at other places, and also my student Kelly Wienersmith, and sort of in an overall collaboration there. How many of you have heard about this system? Just raise your hand. Okay, so what it is it's a system where this is how the feedbacks seem to work, is if you are a fish, killifish that is on the bold, active, aggressive, exploratory side, you just move around a lot, you get more exposed to these trematodes, thus you pick up more trematodes in your brain and actually others in your liver that might affect your behavior. But the key then is when you get more trematodes, the trematodes possibly even influence gene expression in your brain in ways that make you even more bold, active, and aggressive, disposing you to thus pick up even more trematodes that has this ongoing positive feedback loop. And the fish then appear to just spiral out of control, but it actually takes months for it to build up. But they spiral out of control, and eventually they do stuff that is so crazy, bold and flashy, that they get eaten by a bird, and the bird is the final host for the parasite. So the parasite has apparently manipulated the animal, the fish, into letting itself get carried away in the parasite getting moved to its final host. One of these host manipulation systems. But along the way, it appears to have this positive feedback loop that conceivably even influences the overall personality of that fish, or stabilizes it, or keeps it in the way it is. Along the way, we're just looking at whether or not this seems likely. This also affects the foraging behavior and role that these fish have in the community. They're the most abundant fish in these marshes, and what role they have, not only by being eaten by birds, but as foragers themselves. We think it could be important, and it could also even influence their mating success and the social dynamics. So overall, though, this positive feedback loop we think is part of what maintains the personality, but it also has a big effect on overall, actually on ecosystem dynamics, energy flow dynamics between what's going on in the water, moving up to land into the birds and so on, driven by this feedback loop. But it doesn't have to be a positive feedback loop with parasites. The other system we're studying, really for other sorts of main purposes, goes in other ways. And this is work just joined in with Michael Bull on these cool lizards. Here's Tina, who in fact also used to be here, entranced by one of the lizards, I guess. And actually, here's my wife also holding up one of the lizards. And the idea here is what probably also is quite common. So we've got reasonable evidence that the more active, sociable lizards, as a behavioral type, tend to pick up more ticks. And this is the same kind of thing probably happening with you, is more sociable, active people are getting more social interaction, probably thereby picking up more diseases and actually transmitting more diseases to others. But the feedback loop there appears to be negative. And we've got, reasonable evidence, but we need to get more, just the data on what actually seems kind of obvious in the natural history is when you pick up a high parasite load, you start to slow down and move around less. And some hints that they might also be less sociable, and thus that's a negative feedback loop rather than a positive feedback loop. Everybody fine with that? Okay, and so, it could go either way. And that actually feeds into where the models have then gone in their emphases, is to explain variation in phenomena about personalities. We acknowledge that nature has a mix of negative and positive feedback loops, where a key is the relative importance of these two factors. And if negative feedback dominates, then you don't expect long-term maintenance of different behavioral types, because instead you're getting that convergence. You'll still have some variation, certainly, but you have more variation and consistent differences if you've got the positive feedback loops dominating. And so to figure out which of these dominates more, then what we do is actually acknowledge that it depends, no doubt, on things about the ecology, the social system, the state behavior dynamics, which is to say now we need specific models on how feedback loops might actually work in, say, your system. And so an example that I think is still the only example where this negative and positive feedback loops both emphasized is a model that I did with Barney Lutbeg a few years ago, where we did have a simple dynamic programming model that this is the flow chart describing the basic idea of it. I'm not going to get into the model pretty much at all, but just to note that this is a almost standard model of how do animals do things in a world where they have risks, that if they are more active, they get more risk, that they may get killed, but they do get more resources. Where asset protection is in the model, starvation avoidance, which is also a negative feedback loop, is in the model, but we add in state-dependent safety, and in other models we add in state-dependent foraging success. That if you're in better shape, you can be safer and get more food per unit of time. And that when you put these in and just run the model, we get results like this, where this is a parameter space of different levels of resources in the environment, what you would get by being bold. And this is the predation risk of, how much would you be likely to get killed if you're bold. But it is state dependent, how much these enter in. And then it turns out the model generates that in this black zone across the diagonal is when the positive feedback actually dominates and you expect divergence into separate types. And in the other parts of this parameter space, we actually don't get, we get negative feedback dominating. And again, not to dwell on the details of this model, it's just the general approach of having specific models that might fit enough the biology of your specific system, thinking in terms of where are the positive and negative feedbacks to generate some predictions, explicit predictions on what kinds of things you might expect to see about personalities. So this particular model also generates predictions on should early experience in the sense of early state in this state behavior feedback, should early state affect later behavioral type? And in fact, in some conditions it does, and this is actually the actual plot of what the model predicts, that it does predict a range of later boldness depending on early state. But in fact, that only comes in when positive feedbacks are dominating in these sort of intermediate, this diagonal band of conditions. During those conditions, we are basically predicting an early developmental window where things that happen to you early, that affect your early state, influences your later behavioral type, and it's actually an adaptive positive feedback loop that's doing that. But under other conditions, in fact, where negative feedbacks dominate, we predict actually no effect of early experience on later behavioral type. That is, the developmental window notion that developmental biologists often talk about is not, in this modeling framework, a constraint at all. It's not like developmental system, it will make things happen in this way. It's actually predicting that, of course, with negative feedback loops, early things don't matter that much. The things are going to converge later. Okay, so we're actually trying to predict when do you get an early developmental window or not for personality. And you can talk with Jay Belsky more about that next week, because he'll come in and probably talk about parallel things from his view. These models also make predictions on variation in various other things that people might be interested in, but I'm not going to take the time to talk about it more because I've got the other 2 chapters that I want to talk about. So I'm going to finish this chapter by just saying that in fact, myself and Max Wolf and Niels Dingemans and a couple of our postdocs are now writing a paper on just sort of summarizing the models and the general notion of these feedbacks and how might an empiricist actually study this with real data and real experiments. And so that's chapter 1. Questions now, or should I just blaze away further or stop and chat about this? Because the next one is completely different topic. Just keep going? Okay, all right. So that was the notion we need some general theory in this field. So we're testing predictions. Another thing I think we really need in this field is just a stronger connection of social dynamics with behavioral syndromes or animal personalities. Questions like, and so here I just show pictures of grad students and their social dynamics. Here they're singing karaoke, actually. But just the general notion that clearly what you do, how well things work for you, depends not just on your personality, but on the mix of personalities and the social dynamics in your group. We know that obviously. How do social interactions and the social situation interact with your individual personality to determine your behaviors? And for that matter, how does all that affect the outcomes? How well you do, how the social dynamics work, and so on. I think it's almost obvious that in many systems, this is the way it is. These phenomena are mixed. And in fact, game theory has long made that even a central premise, that the mix of behavioral types in the social group matters, that the relative frequency of hawks and doves or cooperators and defectors or whatever's in your model affects the fitness of each type as well as the overall dynamics, the social dynamics. But although we've had these sort of 40 or more years of game theory modeling, we actually have had still, but now a growing number, but still a small number of experiments manipulating the mix of behavioral types in groups to see what actually happens. Now, game theory has by and large continued to go with very simple behavioral types that quite likely don't exist at all in nature. So there are probably no pure hawks or pure doves who are always aggressive or always unaggressive. Instead, individuals have realistic social behavioral types. And so we need models with these more, we need to basically integrate what we now know about behavioral types with what game theory is talking about. What I'm going to do here is just show you some of the experiments we've been doing on how the mix of behavioral types seems to influence things in a behavioral type dependent way. Okay, and what we have had is this sort of desire to basically do what Survivor Island does, but to do it with replicated systems where I guess our fantasy is to get control over 20 of these programs where we get to set up the mixes of people experimentally with controlled treatments and then study, what happens experimentally. And I don't actually watch this show, but I think it's now had, 10 runs or more? So I know people have actually talked about doing a study after the fact on how does the mix of whatever influence dynamics. But it'd be more cool if we could get control of 20, maybe 40 of them and even set things up experimentally and so on, maybe do experimental perturbations in the middle. But instead of doing that on humans, my lab has elected to do it with water striders. And these are these bugs. And they live naturally in streams that look like this, relatively small streams. And in fact, they also live comfortably in these artificial stream pools, artificial stream systems, where actually they'll even live their whole lives here. We can leave them alone and they'll go through generations where we don't do anything. We just come back and see what's up. But when we do experiments, we just focus in and get lots of data here, some here. And much of what they're doing, which makes them one of the model systems that's had several labs studying them for years and years, is they have lots of sex. So what they're doing normally is during the mating season in the spring, the males are cruising around and actively trying to mate with everything they come across, so certainly with females. And the typical mating interaction is no courtship. Male jumps on female, tries to overcome any resistance she has, and mate. And females typically, quote unquote, don't want to mate. They resist heavily, almost certainly because they have sperm storage for 3 weeks at a time, and they don't need to mate over and over and over and over and over. And if they don't resist, males will push them to mate over and over. And each time they do end up mating, which is only happening if males can overcome female resistance, then typically the male rides on the back of the female for several hours. And the interpretation is that's mate guarding, keeping other males away during that period. And this is a pain for a female, as it would be for any of us, to carry somebody around on your back for a few hours at a time, day after day after day. But that's what they do. And what females, the advantage they gain, the only benefit they gain out of that is if they don't do that, they get harassed continually. They can't do anything, really. If they want to go out and feed and just have normal life, they're just going to have to carry a male around on their back. Okay, so that's life for the water strider. So there's lots of sex going on. Each time they mate, the male's riding on the back of the female for 4 hours at a time, 6 hours, 10 hours. So we can see it, and they're doing this every day. So typical individual is mating every day, maybe even more than once a day with different partners. So we get a massive amount of data on mating patterns and social patterns quickly. When they're not mating, males are fighting with each other quite a lot, and the system has lots of sexual coercion. Okay, so it's a cool data generating system, fun animals to begin with. And what we figured out some time ago is males do have some consistency in their behavioral type, in their sort of activity aggression tendencies, and that does relate to mating success, but it can get you killed and so on. And what I'm going to tell you about today is just the experiments on mixing different mixes of behavioral types. And the work that I've been doing here started out with Jason Waters, who's now actually in charge of behavioral studies at the San Francisco Zoo, Ann Chang, who just finished a PhD, Tina Wei, who did a postdoc with me. Actually, this is Jonathan Pruitt, who also worked on it some. So a group of us, and a lot of the data are from these artificial streams. And the basic kind of experiment that we've done several times on how the mix matters goes like this. That we're interested in how something about the group mix affects what individuals do, how the outcomes work. And what we do is we run this 3-stage experiment where first we put them in random social groups and just quantify the behavioral types of individual males and females. And they live like this for typically 5 days or so. And we've already got a ton of data after 5 days. Then, based on what they did here, we build groups with different treatments. And here I just listed the treatment where they differ in their average aggressiveness and activity. A high aggression group, everybody's that type. Medium aggression group, everybody's that type. Low aggression group. And typically we would be able to run 8 replicates of each of these treatments. But in other experiments, we vary the sex ratio or the variance in behavioral type as opposed to the mean, and so on. And then after we study them there for some amount of time, then actually what we do is we open up partitions that had kept them in a pool with a specific group, and we allow them to do social situation choice, where rather than stick in the group they were in, they get to go where they want. And that is actually obviously a crucial part of life, is attempts to choose your social situation in a world where everyone else is also, quote unquote, attempting to choose their social situation. Okay, but this is the standard experiment we've run various versions of. Yeah?
Are you tagging individuals?
Oh yeah, sorry, I should have said that. Every individual's got a little number on it. And in the field, that's also the case. Hundreds, up to the hundreds or even into the thousands. Everyone's got their little number. Females have got little color dots and so on. Okay, so right, we're tracking hundreds of individuals through something like this. And what we found, although could easily be an entire seminar on this sort of stuff, but what I'll emphasize here is that one thing that comes out over and over again as being one key part of the whole thing is a key behavioral type, the hyper-aggressive male. And what these guys do is they are totally out of control in the sense that they want to mate with everything. So they do certainly jump on females and try to overcome their resistance and mate with them, but they're also jumping on males and trying to mate with them and basically beating them up and furiously trying to get them into position and mate with them and struggling with them for minutes on end. They try to peel apart pairs, but that almost never works. They're trying to mate with large juveniles. And I always say some of them were seen apparently trying to mate with the dead crickets that are the food in the experiment. They jump on everything and seem to try to mate with it. And by doing that, they totally mess up the social dynamics for everybody in their group. Okay, so the existence of these hyper-aggressive males, hams, their presence, and I should say they don't keep doing it, most of them don't keep doing it indefinitely. Most of them seem to flare up and do it for perhaps just a few days and then calm back down again. Okay, but in fact, enough of them end up doing it that as roughly 40% of the groups we look at have a hyper-aggressive male roughly 10 to 20% of the time or more. Yeah?
Why are you getting the hyper-aggressive males in the low sort of aggression groups?
Yeah, I'm going to mention that as a conspicuous thing about so-called social plasticity. So I'll say that in a minute. Right, so this is now just contrasting for each of the three treatments in this particular experiment of average aggressiveness activity, the activity of males when there's no ham versus when there is one. And the obvious thing is the hyper-aggressive male being present really does drive everybody else into hiding, basically. And if they can leave the pool, most of the other individuals just leave totally rather than live with one of these hyper-aggressive males. And so this is the obvious social plasticity that, of course, the actual behavior depends on the individual's behavioral type, but also, in this case, on the presence of the hyper-aggressive males. But what's more, we do have the extreme social plasticity that some of the so-called low aggression males did become hyper-aggressive. We do have this happening. And our interpretation there is that some males that, again, were very calm on their own, when put into an environment where everybody is kind of sluggish and calm, some of them actually, got more aggressive, and some of them even went hyper-aggressive. We don't have enough of this yet to have a deep understanding of who did this and exactly why, but I think that sort of social plasticity is there. Though to say it again, it is very clear that there's a strong statistical signal of behavioral type, but on top of that, of individual differences in behavioral type, but on top of that, there is this sort of thing. And by being hyper-aggressive, they drastically reduce the amount of mating activity going on in the pool, in part because they've driven the females into hiding, but also in part because they've driven the other males into hiding. And this is actually group selection against the hyper-aggressive male, right? So he's messed up the whole group that he's in. This phenomenon led us to a buzz term that, I'd love to make up buzz terms for the field. And this buzz term is the keystone individual, which is drawn from ecology, having keystone species, keystone predators. But here it's the individuals that have a disproportionately large effect on the overall group dynamics. And that is our hyper-aggressive males clearly are doing that. It could be alpha males and females in general, but it's not automatic on that because it's not just that they're dominant, it's how much do they even interact with others and affect the overall social dynamics. It could be conflict mediators that have been seen in some primates. Basically there are lots of anecdotes out there, but relatively little sort of science on keystone individuals, and that's something we've been pushing on, determinants and consequences of when does it occur and what effects does it have. So we have a new paper that I think has just been accepted in Animal Behavior on just sort of more thinking about and examples of this keystone individual concept. Now these hams mess up life for everybody else, but one at a time, do they enjoy high mating success themselves? Right, so that's a key question. They're trying so hard to mate with everything. Do they at least get to mate quite a lot? And so here, I'm actually just showing you one of many data sets we have that all have the same answer. But this is just now a multivariate analysis on determinants of male mating success. And I'm showing you here that being more active and aggressive, but we're going to call hyperaggressiveness a separate trait. But just being more active and aggressive per se has a positive coefficient in the effect on mating success. So being active is a good thing for mating success. Being in a social environment with hyperaggressive males is bad. It's a negative coefficient. You mate less if you live in a pool with a hyperaggressive male. But the last part I'll throw in here then is, what's the coefficient for these guys themselves? And in fact, it's strongly negative. That they basically waste so much time trying to mate with everything in sight that we actually see that they end up not even seeing females that go by. They're busily struggling with a male. As well as they've driven all the females out of their pool. And in fact, it seems to be they also have low mating success by any measure. Yeah?
Why are they sticking around? Why are they so troubled?
Yeah, okay. So that in fact is... Oh, so I'm going to do another buzz term and then come back to that. But I see that I've gone on for so long, I'm not going to actually get into this, the detailed description of it, but it has spawned in us this other concept of social skill, and here how social skill relates to mating success. And so the broad, simple message that I outline in great detail here, but I just see I'm taking too long, is that most studies in behavioral ecology on sexual selection and mating success focus on ornaments, physical ornaments or acoustic ornaments, song and so on, and how that affects female choice and thus mating success per attempt by males. But in fact, oddly enough, that actually takes much of the behavior out of the behavioral ecology of mating success. So our newer emphasis is on how personality and how males do things, but also how skillfully they do various things in mating interactions, obviously important in humans, and I think even obviously important in other systems if people were actually looking for it. But we haven't been. For the last 20 or more years, we've been really focused on measuring how red is that red spot and how big is that badge, rather than looking at what are they doing. And so here, as in many systems, we're championing the fact that it's possible to quantify aspects of skill and how it relates to mating success. And so the rest of this is this very complicated flow chart of ways that skill might matter. And I'm not going to go into all that because it would take more time than I want to devote to it. But if that interests you, I'd be more than happy to tell you more about it. What we've basically done is quantify essentially all these arrows in water striders to be able to say how important is social skill in different ways. So, oh, did the fellow actually leave just now? So he will never find out. He will live miserable forever. Yeah, okay, so anyway, why do these hyperaggressive males even exist? And it appears the latest results we just got have what we think is a conceivable hint that it is that these dominant males that actually drive other males into hiding and are busily just being hyperaggressive, they seem to do well in smaller pools. And so in nature, natural streams have a mix of larger pools with lots of water striders, and then in between these faster flow areas with little pools dotted around. And like everybody else in this, working on this system for the last 30 years, we have focused on what's going on in the larger pools where there's lots of striders, but in fact, lots of them are in the smaller pools in between. And we finally decided to do an experiment on what's going on in the smaller pools. And after some preliminary work that made us go, oh my God, it's totally different, we then did a larger experiment that goes like this. This is the kind of thing you can do again with striders is we start out with, in fact, replicate groupings of blocks of 4 small pools, each with 3 males and 3 females. Those same individuals will then be, and all marked and so on, will be put into a larger pool with 12 males and 12 females now. And then they'll be reallocated out randomly into new groups of 3 and 3. And we do this with 10 blocks, so we have 80 replicate groups of 3 and 3. And I guess that's 10 groups of these 12 and 12. And we track what they did and how things went throughout the whole thing. And what we got was a result that basically shocked us. And I don't know if it'll shock you as much since you don't work on water striders all the time, but they totally surprised us. This is our description of standard strider land that, again, many labs have worked on the details of. It's what you see in larger pools. Most of the males are out there actively cruising around, apparently looking for females and jumping on each other also. A few of the females are active, but mostly they've been driven into hiding. And in fact, there's lots of mating going on, and the matings typically involve these long mate guarding durations, hours. Okay, but in the smaller pools, what we got is what we think could be called a harem instead. Because in the small pools, one male ends up being active, does most of the mating, drives the other males into hiding. Most of the females are active. He's leaving them alone and allowing them to forage and be active rather than harass them continually. Not much mating is occurring, mostly by the alpha male. And the matings are now 20 minutes instead of 2 to 10 hours. Basically, they're only long enough to just transfer sperm, no mate guarding. And so in these smaller pools, we're deciding, it seems like we can call it this. Alpha male takes over, drives the other males into hiding, does not harass the females, mates with them occasionally with no long-term, sort of longer contact mate guarding, presumably because he doesn't have to guard the female because he's already driven the other males into hiding. And if he did guard one of the females by sitting on her back, he wouldn't actually even be able to keep the other males from coming down and mating with the other females. So just sort of, to us, an amazingly fundamental shift in the mating system. And what's more, it only takes a few days for these harems to emerge. So this is days since the group was formed versus what proportion of the overall pools are of this type. After 4, 5, 6 days, about half of the pools have become these harem pools. In about 10 or 15% of them, they are ham pools, which is that one male has driven everybody into hiding, males and females. But in fact, I didn't emphasize it here, but some of the pools are still standard strider land. And then a few of the other pools have everybody's on the water, nobody's mating, and we don't know what to make of that, but it seems like they've even just fallen out of the mating season. They're all active, they're all cruising around doing stuff, but nobody's mating. And we're debating about whether or not we should call that assistant professor land. But yeah.
Sorry, quick clarification. So the dominant male in the harem groups is not a ham?
Right, we only call him a ham if he's also driven the females into hiding. So it does appear almost discreetly in some of the pools, all 3 females are on the water.
So this doesn't,
But in other pools, they're all off the water.
so it doesn't explain why be a ham then?
Yeah, that's true. Being a ham here is still a bad idea, but what we have some evidence of, but we need to get more data, is do these guys who are actively driving males off the water actually tend to then still be hams more than others when they get into the larger pools? Okay, so we actually haven't finished those. This is like the new stuff we're excited about. What we find even maybe most striking, but in some ways not that surprising, is when you move them from the small pools to the large pool, this is really fast and reversible. Within an hour or two, the whole system is back to normal strider land. When you put them back into small pools, it takes a few days to go back to one of these systems. But again, you put them back into large pools, and within an hour or two, it's back to strider land. So the entire mating system is rapidly reversible, which means we can study a lot of the things about that whole social system shifting back and forth.
So that's cool, but
Uh-huh.
is that a behavioral type then? Are you comfortable?
Oh, yeah, yeah. So the behavioral type.
Look, you started this whole thing trying to get it.
Yeah.
This is a social.
Right, so what we've got is each individual can live in totally different social worlds, but we still have a behavioral type if there are carryovers in how they live in these different social worlds. Right? So we've got the thing that in fact, it tends to be the biggest male as a statistical tendency in each small group that emerges as the alpha. And we do have a signal that when he goes into a larger pool, he does not behave the same as other males. In fact, he tends to continue to be more aggressive than he ought to be, and often has lower mating success for several days at least, presumably because he's carried over a lifestyle that no longer works. So that's the behavioral type sort of personality still in there. Yeah.
So I'm confused about how the behavior is changing between the harem type and the larger pools that is causing the females to now stay on the water rather than disappear. I mean, is there...
Rather than leave the pool, or?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
If these males are behaving in essentially the same way,
yeah, yeah.
why are the females sometimes choosing to stay and sometimes choosing to
in a big pool?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, in this experiment, nobody gets to choose which world they live in. They were in small pools, they got moved to a large pool where they have to stay there, and we see what they do, and then they go back to a small pool, and we've done actually other combinations of, you know, what's coming first and second and so on. So the experiment that will come next year, even more clearly if we can get some NSF funding to keep going on this, is the pool size choice, because what we have from the field data actually is it does tend to be that larger males are in small pools with only a few females. So we see a field pattern where we haven't screened them off. They don't have to stay where they are, where they get to choose their social situation. We see a field pattern that's consistent with this overall story, and that different individuals are choosing different situations. But what we'd like to do next is even look in more fine detail as to which behavioral type actually chooses which situation in what way. Yeah?
Just a quick clarification. When you're talking about mating success, it sounds like in some of these pools, the mating number is just redundant. You know, you don't need to mate that much to fertilize all the eggs. Do you actually have evidence of that the number of matings affects the fertility of the females?
The number of eggs you get to fertilize? Yeah, so other people have worked quite a bit on how sperm competition dynamics work, and it doesn't appear to be tremendously complex. So there's nothing of the sort like females doing cryptic female choice that anyone has discovered, where you could mate many times and get nothing out of it. So what we're doing here is having this sort of statistical generality that if you mated 10 times, you did get more fertilized eggs out of it than a male on average who mated 5 times versus 1 time. But we definitely have not done the genetics to substantiate male by male.
Female, and you're in the presence of a hen, does that actually reduce the female's fecundity, or is she still laying as many eggs as...
Yeah, we don't have experimental evidence on that, but if she actually had even less feeding than otherwise, because I think it's her feeding rate that would affect her long-term fecundity. Yeah, and I should say females are laying a new batch of eggs every couple of days. So it's a sort of ongoing thing of getting food, laying some eggs on, you know, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually thinking along those lines because you might expect females to have higher fitness in the harem situation. Where they're not getting ridden for hours at a time. They're able to move
that's
around,
right.
Able to feed.
Yeah.
And so that's going to maintain the part of the confusion I think is over the terminology. If you just talk, if you define hams in terms of their disruptive attributes, those are socially contingent.
Yeah.
It's, at least in my mind, it's a little confusing. If you just say there are aggressive males, and when they're in a small pool, they're able to successfully achieve an alpha status of a harem. And when they're in a larger pool, they aren't, and they're really disruptive. Then in a small pool, they're going to have high fitness. The females are going to have higher fitness, and so the aggressive male type gets perpetuated, right? And we might think, well, the females then should move to small pools, but of course their population density becomes a problem. So they end up in big pools, and you get what looks like a maladaptive pattern where the males are doing what would work in a small pool and doesn't work in a big pool.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've summarized basically how I think about it. I mean, there's loads more data we need to collect to see, in particular, the sort of dynamics of movement between these two different pool sizes and their associated social environments. I do want to also emphasize that in the small pools, only about half of them end up as quote-unquote harems, and in some cases the male still is this disruptive guy who's messed up things for everything for everybody else is hiding. for days on end. He's the only animal on the water. Everyone else is climbed out and hiding. But then we get these other things. So I think for us, that's still something interesting to sort out. And I think it would be in any system where you have multiple possible sort of social mating systems. Why do they go where they go? Even is it something about the mix of behavioral types, or is it the mix of sizes, or what is it that disposes a group to go into one of alternative social systems? And for that matter, can we even discern like the earliest point that it's now in the trajectory towards one of those systems, and what was going on that, just a host of questions about even development of alternative social systems. I think of that as an interesting question for any humans. And here we're hoping to actually be able to do a bunch of experiments on it.
So
yeah.
You frame this in terms of sort of the facultative adjustment of behavior in light of the social context, but to the extent that there's heritable variation there, you might think about the 50% success rate in the harems, that 50% of them turn out to be harems. That's stabilizing selection, right? So without that, there's always selection favoring more aggressivity, right? And some of the males, as a consequence, are going to be overshooting, and so even in a nice small pool, they're acting like Arnold, right? And that's selecting against too much of that heritable tendency to be aggressive, right?
No, and I think the fact that if they did end up in a larger pool and just kept doing that, it's even, the data are more full and clear cut. That's not a good idea. And I think basically what we're doing is we have the ability and opportunity in the course of just, months of work rather than 50 years of work or whatever, to start to sort out how do these things connect up. I mean, I think you've pretty much also summarized how I'm thinking about this. And I think that's basically all I was going to say about this, other than to just finish up by noting that there are many interesting questions about the interaction between social, behavioral ecology, and personality that actually is mysteriously not much studied yet, though I know some of the people here working on primates have done some of that, but less than you would think overall. Okay, let's see. Other comments on that section? Yeah.
Is it personality or a behavioral syndrome if size is really what's driving?
Oh, yeah, okay, that's it. Right. Yeah, that's been a sort of a just a discussion point that people have asked when it's something that's obvious that we've always known, bigger males quite likely would be more aggressive, or for that matter, dominant animals might be more aggressive. Is it still a personality if basically their behavioral type is connected to something in a way that is obvious to us and always has been? And I don't tend to get it deeply involved in, what might be a semantic issue of whether or not you want to call it that or not. But my general sense is that we do generally believe that if there's a behavioral type or personality, it has some underlying mechanism that it's connected to. And in some cases, we can't see it as easily. But in other cases, we can see it and it's always been more obvious. But I don't think anyone would doubt that you would call it a personality if it has some genetic neuroendocrine basis. Does that sound reasonable? It's still a personality.
So you can have genetic variability that influences size, though.
Yeah, sure, right.
The whole thing that's driving it. And then size influences the likelihood of success.
Yeah, so I think what I'm ending up saying, though, I may have wandered off in a bit of a ramble there, but if there is some behavioral type that's consistent and there's any variety of things underlying it, I don't have an a priori philosophical scientific basis for saying which of these things that are related to it and could say underlie it makes it still a personality versus others you would say, no, that's not a personality anymore. And so I think no one seems to have doubted that if it has a genetic basis, it's still a personality because, behavioral tendencies have a genetic basis. And I'm not sure why you would then say if it's size as opposed to some genetic thing, or it's even a dominance rank, that it is fundamentally different in a way that you wouldn't then still call it a personality if in fact you define personality just as behavioral consistency with individuals having different consistent behaviors. Yeah, and that's, I think other than making my statement on it, I don't have any, I don't demand people to see it my way, but that's how I see it. Okay, so I have this one last chapter that again is 10 or 15 minutes of me talking, and I guess I'll just do it. And this is on ecological implications, which we have done lots of study on, but I'll tell you about one general study in my lab. What we do know, and we as the royal we of the whole field of ecology, is that behavioral type affects fitness, and thus is ecologically relevant. And if anything, Dan had an earlier review on this, and it's clear enough that if you're bold versus and aggressive versus not, it has different effects on fitness. We do also have a long history in ecology of noting that species seem to differ in their behavioral type, that some species are more aggressive than others, and that's part of the ecology of competition. Some species are more bold and do well in low predation habitats, outcompeting maybe in some way less bold species, but that cautious species that hide more do well in high-risk habitats, and that species differ in how exploratory or innovative they are, flexible, and that is related to their invasion into new situations. And so we don't want to, these are sort of behavioral syndrome type statements about ecology, but we don't want to actually say that now that we're studying behavioral syndromes, we've got anything new. This is, ecologists have always said this sort of thing. So it's not sort of a new implication. What we're interested in is new insights that hadn't been a major part of ecology, associated with sort of the key aspects of what is a behavioral syndrome, within species variation in behavioral type, and these behavioral correlations across different contexts. And how do those phenomena have sort of new insights for various, and there's just a list of some of the major issues in ecology. And so a couple of actually review papers came out last year on that. And what I'm going to do is just tell you about some of the work we've been doing with invasion ecology and how behavioral syndromes relates to it. And for invasions, it was suggested early on that one could look at an invasion in 3 steps, where the species spreads. Often we help them spread, but often they then spread from wherever we first introduced them in on their own. They have to be a pest, an invader, they have to be able to establish well in new places. That is, they need to do well at low density. And then the pests also end up growing to high density, do well at high density, and have a big impact. And all along, they seem to spread a bunch into yet new places. This is what an invasive pest does. It does all those things well. And there are some number of studies, of which I just stated some by some of my own students, where the general high geared up, aggressive, active, bold type species and individuals seem to be good at both of these, doing well no matter what the density is. But then dispersal tendency, just tendency to move a lot, would seem to influence how much they spread, and maybe also how well they establish when they first disperse. And so a question of interest to see why some species do all of this is, what's the connection between these two? Which in fact you could call behavioral type dependent dispersal. How does that work? And you know, a decade or so ago when we first started thinking about this, I give credit to Lauren Pintor, who was a PhD student at that time in my lab, and you know, now a faculty member at Ohio State. And the basic idea she started out with is that, you know, in a source pool back at home, you might have some mix of, let's say, bold and shy individuals, and that you wouldn't be surprised if the dispersers are non-random with respect to behavioral type. In fact, if they do active dispersal, you might even be surprised if they were random with respect to something as important as personality type. But what you might have is it's the bold individuals that tend to disperse because they are bold, and you know, they are exploratory perhaps also, and they have no fear of going out on their own, off into the wilderness. If they go into areas without heavy predation risk, without predation risk, given that they're also often active and aggressive, they might do really well at being invasive, in fact, pests. Of course, if they go into areas with lots of predation risk, they might have trouble, would be excluded by predators since they're bold, so they might need what ecologists call enemy release to succeed. But it doesn't actually have to be this way. It could just as well be that in other social systems, it's the relatively shy, perhaps unaggressive subordinates that are driven out to disperse. And if that's why dispersal works the way it does, then these individuals might establish okay in new places, but they'd be less likely to be pests in the new places. General idea. And after we actually discussed this idea in an early New York Times Magazine section article about personalities with me in there quite a lot, I got an email from a woman who just read the New York Times Magazine article and pointed me to this book, actually by Peter Wybrow here at UCLA. And I imagine Peter Wybrow's not in the room right now, but if he is, he should say so. Do you guys know Peter Wybrow? Yeah, okay, so you guys, so I've never met this person, but I read the book, and I'm now summarizing in very simple terms a major part of the book, which is, it's called the American Mania Hypothesis, and it's the general notion that America has a general psyche of being sort of rebels who are fortune seekers, who take chances, but are also kind of fringing over to being greedy and thus having a large ecological footprint, driving SUVs, eating too much, getting obese. That's America. Or it could be Australia. And when you ask, why is America that way, then ultimately, in large part, it might be because we are the melting pot of those type people from the rest of the world. And that this is a quote from the book, that migrant from elsewhere is that maverick running at the edge of the human herd. And essentially 98 hunkered down and accepted what's going on back in wherever. And the two that came to America were those type people. And you build a whole country out of that, wave after wave, that you continue having America. And of course, that's got to be an oversimplification. People came here for various reasons. But this basic idea, in fact, is what has now been studied in loads of other animals, but mostly in just the last few years, that it's a particular personalities that disperse into new places, and that fact has a big effect on the ecology of how they do things in the new place. So these are just some of the animals that have been studied in this context. And we have been doing it with an invasive pest, the mosquito fish, which is officially listed as one of the top 100 invasive pests in the world. And the work on this was led by a postdoc, former postdoc, Julien Cote, who's actually now a faculty member at Toulouse, and a former PhD student who's now postdocing at Princeton. And what we found, to just tell the story rather than actually show a bunch of the data, is that dispersal depends on the social, asocial tendencies of these mosquito fish. And they are schooling little fish, and everybody thinks of them as being highly social, but when you run them through an assay where you put one fish in the middle and it can either go hang out close to a school behind a glass window or go to the other side or whatever, most of them go and actually hang out next to the school. They're social, but quite a few of them don't, and some of them actually go to the other side, and they're more asocial, and it's a repeatable thing. And when you quantify that, you find that furthermore, when you put them in a dispersal assay, dispersal depends on their sociability type in ways that are also density dependent. So who disperses? A mix of density and the behavioral type. And the basic idea being that other experiments also show that at high density, social individuals do well at high density. Asocial individuals actually do worse at high density, and that makes sense that they disperse. And it's sort of, they don't like it, at high density they leave. Whereas at low density, it's the other way around. Asocials, quote unquote, know how to live well in feeding and anti-predator stuff at low density. And it's the socials that don't do well with low density. They can't even form a good school, and they tend to leave. Invasions require species to do well at low and high density. And what we need here in this sort of dynamic is a mix of behavioral types, where the asocial individuals are those good invaders doing well at low density, but the social individuals are the ones that build up to and become pests at high densities. And the mix of behavioral types then drives the overall invasion, is at least our story. That we have a lot of the supporting data, but we haven't actually tracked an entire invasion, but we did model it. So this is Sean Fogarty's mathematical model, shown as a little picture cartoon, where you have an established patch with asocial and social individuals, and you ask who would leave here, and it would be the asocial individuals. They don't like high density, they leave, and they're the ones that would actually colonize new habitat. In fact, social individuals that leave here wouldn't even colonize here because they don't stay, if they're the only one, into a new habitat. The asocials go in, but their very presence then facilitates socials joining them, and then density gets high again, driving the asocials out, so they colonize yet new habitat, joined again by the social individuals. So the asocials are facilitating the invasion of the socials, but the socials keep the asocials moving. And in reality, they don't have asocials and socials. There's a range of actual behavioral types, but this is the cartoon version of the model, and the mix really is explosively invasive. After we did this model, I ended up talking with a historian for American history, realizing that that story made sense to him and to us that we grew up with, this story as, again, American history, where the movement of Americans from the East Coast to the West might actually be the asocial and also bold types, which we also got in mosquito fish, tending to go ahead of the others and colonize new places where nobody else is around, but their very presence allowed others to move in around them, thus actually inducing them to move further west and so on, culminating in, right now, still the bold, asocial weirdos living, of course, up in Alaska. You know, Sarah Palin and all. And so there's actually no, apparently no one has attempted to quantify this for American history. And the historian was very intrigued that we actually mathematically modeled it. Could they do something with it? But we haven't really moved forward on that. Final point I'll note in the talk here is that how all this works also depends on stuff like, are there predators in the system? Because survival with predators also depends on sociability in a density-dependent way. So at low density, what I'm showing here is the sociability score, where this is more social and that's less social, of the survivors versus those that got eaten in an actual predation study. And the survivors are just more asocial than the ones that got eaten at low density. Okay, and what we also find is, this fits in the notion that at low density, asocials do better, socials tend to leave. But actually at medium to high density, it flips around to where it's the social individuals that survive better. And the ones that get eaten are the more asocial ones. So we culminate with the notion that both for the modeling and maybe probably for the actual ecology, it is that general ecology, back in any source place of the density, the predation risk, how competition works, all affect performance. And then you know, the associated dispersal, if you're not doing well in a place, works on how invasions work. So we continue to get more data on behavioral type-dependent performance and dispersal, but how it's a function of various major ecological factors and modeling how all that would work in invasion dynamics. And we think this is plausibly, you know, a reality, a part of how invasions work. And furthermore, that should be plausibly a reality for anything in spatial ecology, which is many, many topics in ecology just acknowledge that it's not all a uniform world. Different things are happening in different places, and how animals move around has a big effect on metapopulation dynamics, animal use of reserves and corridors, recolonizations, even crop ecology, because crops are where you wipe out the whole thing, you know, plant a new field that is a huge thing. And animals, if they're going to get to the center of a crop field, had to go there. And why would any of them go there? And the collection that goes there is going to be a different set of phenotypes and perhaps personalities, almost certainly species, than those at the edges where they first come in, you know, and so on. That there's just spatial ecology, many topics. The interaction with behavioral syndromes remains, we think, a fertile territory. And so I think, yeah, that's right. In the new version, that's way too long. So I'd be interested in yours. You know, I only added like the new water strider stuff, but somehow it's too long. So I'd be interested in your suggestions on what to kick out now that you were the guinea pigs for the new version this fall. But anyway, now I'm just showing pictures of my original close collaborators here, Chad Johnson and Allison Bell with their dogs, and me with my fish. So thanks much, yeah.
So in humans, the dopamine receptor is highly polymorphic, and Chen et al. Had a nice paper a number of years ago. So the DRD4 long allele is associated. You familiar with this?
Yes, right. Well, that was even in the Weibrow book also, because that's back around 2000 or so. So
distance moved basically from computer origin corresponds.
Yeah.
The Weibrow story is, I mean, it's a sensible story.
Right.
But it's not a documented story. The Chen et al. One is documented.
Yeah. Or, you know, the rhesus monkeys movement, where is it? Was it from, you know, even through some part of the Himalayas is thought to be along those lines also. I don't actually know how well that's documented.
You mean they have Tibetan macaques, but I don't know their...
Maybe it wasn't rhesus monkeys then, yeah. Darn, you know, I'm spacing out his name, but the super famous guy at NIH working on these.
Yeah, Steve Sumi talks about heritage transporter variation.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's kind of a loose...
I would say my sense is no strong consensus on DRD4 actually playing much of a role in these behaviors, having low R square that sometimes you pick up in a significant connection and other times you don't. But no matter how you look at it, it's one gene in a system that is highly likely to be many, many genes through many mechanisms with feedbacks. And you wouldn't expect its R square to be high, and in fact its R square is not high. Whether or not that gene is a good indicator of signal index of the dispersal being behavioral type dependent, also an interesting open question. Yeah, that's my take on it. Yeah. Okay, other thoughts? Yeah.
So I'm really impressed that you tagged those individual water striders. They don't seem like they could be very big. So as a psychologist, I find that to be totally amazing because my subjects are human sized. But I'm wondering about the fact that females store sperm. Could that be so that they can, I was just trying to square that with the notion that mating is so frequent. And could it be that it allows females who find themselves in the big pools to actually go and hide out and feed and for, you know, stretches of time.
Yeah.
Just use their bait.
Right. I'd say it's worth noting that it might be one of those chicken and egg things that I'd have to think more about. But they don't get to feed when they're hiding. So when they're hiding, it really is. They've been driven into the edge banks, just sitting almost out of the water much of the time, and they don't get to do anything. I guess if a piece of food actually drifted in front of them, they could grab it. But by and large, the notion is they're not getting to feed when they're hiding. And that many insects can store sperm for long periods. But here, the fact that they lay a new batch of eggs every couple of days does mean that any male that can guard a female for the rest of the day has a reasonable chance that he's kept males away until she lays the next batch of eggs that will be fertilized, not entirely, but more than random, you know, largely by him, if he can stick with her until she lays the next batch of eggs. But there's some dynamic where, you know, he also doesn't get to feed, and he's also missing out on opportunities to mate with other females. And that somewhere in there, he stays for a few hours. And it's also not clear how often she kicks him off versus he gets off, you know, and so on. But the intriguing notion that given that she has been driven into hiding much of the time and is harassed continually, I have to think more as to whether or not that would even favor being able to store sperm a long time or not. Yeah. Okay, yeah, right.
Anybody else?
Or maybe we should just have a discussion.
I'm happy to share the floor. But,
yeah.
So I want to return to this point that Lynn brought up earlier about is it personality if it's a facultative response to morphology, for example?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that that's tapping kind of a folk model that we have of personality that it's highly heritable and not subject to environmental influence, basically. And that I mean, you can define personality in those terms, but I don't actually think that's a very useful way of defining it, because if you think about life history strategies, for example, right? So if we accept that, you know, that an individual who grows up in a high extrinsic mortality environment with, is going to, you know, steeply discount the future and have rapid maturation and early sexual behavior and so on, and somebody who grows up an organism, whether it's a human or otherwise, in the opposite world has a totally different life history trajectory. Those are consistent behavioral types, and they're entirely facultative, right? I mean, that's a response to the environment. So I'm comfortable calling those types personality. And at least in humans, there's preliminary evidence that, now we don't know whether it's facultative response to morphology or whether the genes are simply linked, but we know that the stronger men are, the more they endorse coercion as an interpersonal strategy, right? And the more they feel entitled to get their way, they behave like your hams, basically, right? Is that because they happen to get the genes for that personality and the genes for more fast-twitch muscle? Or is it because they are realizing that they're stronger than most of the men around them and they're adjusting their behavior in light of the feedback they've received? We don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was the second and not the first. And I'm still happy to call that personality. So, you know, I think we want to be just defining it in terms of behavioral consistency over time.
Yeah, that's right. If you define it in those terms, you're not asking what's the underlying mechanism. In many cases, the quote-unquote underlying mechanism is something obvious that we've always known, that even dominant male behaves differently from a subordinate one. Obviously, we've always known that, but I don't know where to draw a line that says, because we knew the mechanism, but if you define it as just behavioral consistency in this particular statistical way, then, you know, then...
And most of the questions you're asking have to do with current adaptive utility. You know, it's the function of this consistency, how this can play out. So at some level, that opens the door towards what are the mechanisms. They may be
sometimes they'll be genetic,
they may be, you know.
And it should be noted that heritability of behavioral types, personalities in humans or anything else doesn't tend to be that high. It tends to be on the order of 0.3 or thereabouts. Yeah, and I think, or you guys may be more aware of it than I am. I've read the papers where the heritability of almost any behavioral tendency that anybody's ever measured turns out to be between 0.2 and 0.5. You know, even just anything you can imagine about political attitudes, social attitudes, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of amazing, actually. Right. Okay, yeah, thanks a lot.